Welcome back, guys. This is lesson 2. We're going to talk today about a couple of things, and one of them we're going to talk about is prohibition. We're going to talk about the American culture during the Roaring Twenties. Several things are in there, and this is a fun lesson. So remember, we studied last time. We studied the last lesson. We studied the 18th Amendment, and so we're going to talk about a little bit, just very quickly, about that to recap this. In the 1800s, alcohol. You could buy alcohol cheaper than you can buy a cup of tea. And it was so much woven into American culture. And George Washington, the first president of the United States, says this about men who are about to go into battle. He says, "The benefits of strong liquor have been observed in all armies and are not to be disputed." And what he means is that it makes soldiers braver. They'll go into battle much more quickly and they'll do what they're told. But by the 1920s, actually by the early 1900s, Americans they see that alcohol is ruining lives, and so there's this massive campaign to end alcohol in the United States. And so in 1920, the Prohibition Amendment is passed, and you can no longer transport, produce, or sell alcohol. If you already have alcohol, you can drink it, but you cannot buy anymore. You cannot sell anymore, you cannot make anymore, and you cannot transport in a car or a ship or a railroad any alcohol. Look at the next slide. We can see this term conspicuous consumption, and you see on the slide here, you see a picture of a bunch of cars. All along this parking lot are just all kinds of cars, and they all look the same. And look at the next slide. You've got pictures here, and all of the cars look the same. Can you imagine if you can't remember where you parked your car? If you come out of your shopping place and you look out there and you think, oh my goodness, where did we park the car? Well, today your car is a color. Maybe it's bigger or shorter or longer, and you can beep your remote control and your car will beep beep and you can find your car. But then in this day, you could not do that. And so you have to remember very clearly where you park your car. On the next slide, we see the same thing. There's all cars are all very similar colors, and they look very similar, exactly the same. On the next slide, we see a slide that's titled "The Car." By 1930, 60% of American households own a car. 60%. Today, almost all households own 2 cars, and some much more than that. The rural areas, though, were different from the urban. In the urban areas, they would own a car more frequently because they make more money than in the rural areas. Now, the rural areas, they needed a car because they have to drive further, but they just don't have the money to buy one. Henry Ford changes that. He lowers the price of a car. He cuts it. Is able to cut that price of that car really almost in half, and he doubles the cost that he's paying, the wages that he's paying to his workers. And so his goal is to try to get the car so that the price is low enough that the masses of America can buy it. And he does, and he makes a lot of money at it. And car manufacturing accounts for 9% of the U.S. economy by 1930. Created jobs for steel, for rubber, for tires, for gas, for oil, for road construction, factory construction, advertising, spread of towns. Shopping habits change because now you can drive further to get to town, to shop where you want. Delivery of mail becomes faster. Tourism becomes more common. But until the mid-1920s, you can only buy a black car. But the car changes everything. On the next slide, we see a picture of a driver's license, paper driver's license. In many towns, you couldn't drive more than more than 5 or 10 miles an hour in the town. And very early on, in the first decade of the 1900s, you had to put an advertisement in the newspaper before you could drive your car in the middle of town. So on the next slide, we see, again, conspicuous consumption. And this term, these 2 words together, we don't hear that until 1899. But today, Americans understand the term conspicuous, which means something you can see. Consumption, which means something that you use. So if you want a nice pair of shoes or a nice jacket or a nice shirt or a nice car or house, that's called conspicuous consumption. The house isn't, because the house doesn't move, but everything else that you own moves, and you can show that off, and you can let people see that you're rich. And this becomes a thing in the 19-teens and 1920s. On the next slide, we see several pictures, America in the Roaring Twenties, and look at all of the things that change American culture. Just look down this list. There's widespread use of electricity and air conditioning, washing machines, cars, credit for credit cards, radios, movies, women can vote. There's massive growth after World War I. There's development growth of celebrity and sports icons, some of which you see here on the slide. And also you have the jazz age, which is jazz music is developed mostly, and a lot of this heavily influenced by African Americans are leading the way in not just one place in the United States, but several different cities in the United States. We have kind of a unique jazz culture developed. New Orleans being kind of out in the front of those. The next slide, we see the flapper, and the flapper is a liberated woman. She drinks, she smokes, she wears short skirts, and she has a job often, and she's likely to vote, and she embraces equality. She wants to be the same as men. And we can see pictures of women here in dresses, and these dresses were considered very, very short back in their day. You really shouldn't be showing any legs or ankles, but these women were very, very progressive for their day. Today we see these dresses and think they're not so long, but times change, and that's a good example of how times are changing. On the next slide, we see Westinghouse Radio. November 2, 1920, they put their first broadcast out, and NBC, which is still a big radio TV network today, organized first in 1926. And they would play concerts on the radio. They would have news. They would have comedy routines. They would have radio theater. They would have baseball games, and you would listen, and the classical music they would play, local bands. So the radio was very exciting for people because people out in the countryside for the first time can begin to hear the things that are happening in the city so far away. Before the radio, the communities are completely disconnected. People can read the newspaper, but many people are not literate enough to read the papers. Look at the next slide. We see Charles Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis. He flies across the Atlantic, the first person to do that by themselves in May of 1927. And Amelia Earhart begins to fly. She's the first woman to cross over the Atlantic. In the next slide, we see Jack Dempsey. This is a picture of Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey fights something like 75 or 78 fights, and he only loses 6 of them in the 1920s. And he's this really powerful puncher, very, very famous boxer in the United States, the first athlete to be in a fight that they bring in $1 million. $1 million is made from people coming to watch the fight. And on the next slide, we see Babe Ruth, and Babe Ruth is one of the most famous American sportsmen in all of American history. He played with the Boston Red Sox as a pitcher, and he was a very good pitcher. But the Red Sox traded him to the Yankees, and he was a great hitter with the Yankees, very famous. And on the next slide, we see the introduction of sound movies with talking and with music. We have movies with music before The Jazz Singer in the 1920s. This is the first talking movie we have. 1916, we can see on this next slide the Electoral College, and I want to show you these just to remind you where we're at here in the 1920s and what America's voting like 1916, because this takes us back a little bit because we just talked about the 1920s. But 1916, we can see that Wilson overwhelmingly wins the presidential election. And then we can see Harding wins the next election, and the Democrat in the South loses. And you can see the South is still voting primarily Democrat. So, all right. So that's where we're going to end it for today, and we'll see you guys next time, and we'll pick it up with the later part of the 1920s, moving into the Great Depression and early 1930s. All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.